Hi there, Under Armour fans. For this part of the tutorial, I'm focusing on the shirt and the methods to give it more texture and a sense of realism through painting. When the original Christopher Reeve Superman film debuted, they of course went with the very classic look, which was mostly a flat spandex or spandex-like material. As time has gone on, and I think audiences have gotten more sophisticated with what they expect out of their films and the costumes that go in them, they've made some transitions. In the Superman Returns film, the costume used a texturing effect all over both the dark red and the blue elements. And I think that just gave it a little bit more depth and a sense of realism. And they took that even further with Man of Steel, where the costume element became even more textured and there's much more relief to the surface. It's kind of like a skin diving suit, and I know in the making of documentaries they've talked about it being like a space flight suit to some degree. When you buy your own shirts from either Under Armour or Nike, as I've mentioned in the buying guide, you're going to get your choice of basic color, of course, but that's going to be a very flat material. Here you can see a portion that I have cut off from the Under Armour shirt that I used, since the top is really just a very simple modification of the long sleeve shirt with the lower portion cut depending on how much you want to show in your overall look. This version doesn't have the texturing that you see in the photo. That's because I wanted to kind of show different stages. For comparison on the color of blue, this is a Nike version in a sleeveless compression top. It's a little less saturated and a little bit lighter color. I liked the Under Armour blue better, but the Nike version also works well. It kind of depends on what you have available and what you're looking for. I'm going to take this shirt off to the side, and let's focus on how we actually give the surface of the shirt some of its extra realism. Whenever you're painting a fabric, you can't just use regular craft paint. It's not going to adhere well to the surface of the fabric, number one, and number two, it's not going to stretch well with the material, especially if we're dealing with a skin-tight costume where the spandex material or whatever it is going to have a need to flex and move with your body. You'll get paint that wants to flake off or crack or peel, and it just won't look very good. So you always want to look for something that's labeled as a fabric paint, and really one of the manufacturers that has pretty much the best line, and they've kind of cornered the market, it's Tulip. And you can look for any number of range of colors. They sell light blue, dark blue, of course every other color in the spectrum. And I happened to research and find this really cool azure blue, which is a metallic blue. And it gives it that contrasting sheen, which is really half the reason why you want to add this texturing effect. It's not just a tonal difference, it's the surface reflectivity that gives the costume an interesting set of variances in the light and the way that it feels and looks. You can see here that on this test piece I've given it a couple different treatments. So the one here is from the Solus template, and the template is a stencil. And it'll be a little hard to see because these stencils are a light plastic, but it makes a lot of sense to use one of these when you're painting, because to do this by hand would be very laborious and a lot of effort. These are actually also relatively inexpensive depending on what you buy. It could be $6 to $12. The ones I've used are all from Crafter's Workshop, so they'll come in a big plastic bag like this. They're 12 by 12, which is great, so you can cover a lot of surface and material. And you can do all sorts of painting techniques with this, spray painting or hand painting. I'm using a simple sponge brush. And depending on the look you want, this one I thought was cool because it had a geometric design and you can kind of keep placing it in different ways. There's a couple different ways you can do this. Depending on the thickness that you lay this metallic paint down, you either get a dark color or you get this truly reflective color, which is really cool looking. And I made this test pattern just by rotating the stencil at 90-degree increments. The other stencil I got, because the underwear I ended up using was a snakeskin texture, and we're doing some interesting interpretation of the Superman costume. I realize snakeskin is kind of an odd choice, But once you get into the more abstract painting technique, it doesn't really look exactly like snakeskin, it's just kind of a texture. And this is the example of the snakeskin template. Again, these are really nice. They're fairly durable. You do want to be careful. There's a lot of really precise cutouts, and if you're too rough with this, you can break them off. And you also want to make sure you wash these relatively quickly after you've applied the paint. The key about fabric paint is it's fairly tacky. It dries really fast, and if you let it dry on the stencil, it'll be hard to scrape it off or clean it off. So the faster you can get to cleaning this off, even in between applications in areas of the shirt, I recommend that, because the more buildup you get, if you have finer detail, it'll get clogged and then your stencil won't be very usable. You can see here an example of the snakeskin texture that I used. So I just applied a few different areas to give it that look, and I applied the paint a little thicker so that it had more of the contrast. You can also see that this stretches well. The fabric doesn't have any problem where it's been painted. If you were to coat the entire surface completely solid with the color, it would become much more stiff. It would still stretch, but not as much. Because we're using a texture that has a lot of gaps and areas where you're not painting it, it really doesn't have a problem with affecting the fit of the fabric. The way that I applied this was just simply laying the fabric down on a flat surface and then figuring out where I wanted to start with the stencil, laying that flat down, getting the sponge brush. Just a simple cheap sponge brush is what I use. I tend to not worry about buying a bunch of these and using them as they are disposable, and just carefully dabbing straight down over the stencil. You don't want to really brush back and forth because you're going to end up pushing the paint underneath the edges of the stencil, and then the edges won't be quite as clean. And you can kind of keep applying that. You can either decide if you want to just do the full round, or if you want to keep rotating this and kind of trying different shapes and angles to make it a little bit more randomized. I think the key to the costume getting that texture is to actually make the pattern somewhat random and not necessarily perfectly uniform, because then it just looks like it was machine printed and not necessarily handmade and put together with a little bit more artistic thought. So that's my quick tutorial on how you can apply the right kind of paint using stencils onto your fabric, especially when it's a compression fabric used for a superhero costume. Check out the other videos for the other reviews and elements relating to the Superman look. Thank you.